You're constantly caught off guard by workplace politics and competition you didn't see coming. While you're focused on doing good work, others are already 3 steps ahead, positioning themselves for the promotions and opportunities you thought were yours. I am Sun Tzu, and I mastered the art of positioning in the deadliest arena of older battlefield, where miscalculation meant death and victory belonged to those who won before the first sword was drawn. In my years of studying warfare and human nature, I discovered that every battle is won or lost before it begins. Through preparation, positioning, and understanding what your opponents cannot see, the strategies I developed for winning without fighting will give you the ability to secure victory in any situation while others are still figuring out what game they're playing. Whether you're fighting for territory in ancient China or fighting for recognition in modern boardrooms, the same principles that determined who lived and who died can determine who rises and who remains invisible. First, show your commitment by liking this video, subscribing for more battle-tested wisdom, and telling me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see which cities and countries are ready to win before the battle begins. My journey into the art of winning before battles begin started in the chaos of the spring and autumn period, when China was fractured into warring states and survival depended on understanding human nature at its most desperate. I was born into a world where kingdoms rose and fell with the seasons, where a single miscalculation could doom entire populations, and where the difference between brilliant strategy and foolish bravado was measured in thousands of lives. As a young man, I watched my father's generation fight wars the old way, charging headlong into battle, believing that courage and strength alone determined victory. I witnessed armies clash with tremendous fury, only to see the same patterns repeat endlessly. The strongest didn't always win. The bravest often died first. The most well-equipped forces sometimes fled in terror. There had to be something deeper at work, some hidden principle that separated victory from defeat. The bamboo scrolls of strategy that would later become my life's work began as simple observations scribbled during long nights of contemplation. I studied every conflict I could witness or hear about, looking for the invisible threads that connected cause to outcome. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about competition and success. I remember the exact moment when the truth revealed itself to me. I was observing a battle between 2 fairly matched armies, positioned on a plain where neither side held obvious advantage. Both generals were competent, both forces were disciplined, both sides fought with equal determination, yet one army achieved total victory while suffering minimal losses, while the other was completely routed despite fighting courageously. The difference wasn't in the fighting, it was in what happened before the fighting began. The victorious general had spent weeks positioning his forces, gathering intelligence about his enemy's supply lines, understanding the terrain in ways his opponent had never considered. When the battle finally commenced, the outcome had already been determined by preparations his enemy never saw coming. That night, I wrote my first principle on bamboo. Supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This wasn't about avoiding conflict, it was about winning so decisively through preparation that actual fighting became unnecessary. I began developing what I call the philosophy of inevitable victory. Most people think of war as unpredictable chaos where anything can happen. I learned to see war as a series of calculated moves where everything can be controlled through superior preparation and positioning. The general who understands more variables, who positions his forces more advantageously, who timing his actions more precisely, the general wins before the first arrow is shot. My methods became legendary, not because I was the fiercest warrior, but because I was the most thorough preparer. While other generals focused on weapons and formations, I focused on intelligence and psychology. While they planned battles, I planned campaigns. While they sought to fight better, I sought to make fighting unnecessary. The scrolls I created documented not just military tactics, but the fundamental principles of human competition. I discovered that whether you're fighting for kingdoms or fighting for recognition in a royal court, the same patterns emerge. The person who understands these patterns and prepares accordingly holds an almost unfair advantage over those who simply react to circumstances. This foundation of strategic thinking, this commitment to winning through preparation rather than confrontation, became the cornerstone of everything I would later teach. It transformed me from just another military officer into someone who could see victory where others saw only uncertainty. What I learned in those early years of observation and experimentation forms the basis of every principle I'm about to share with you. These aren't theories I developed in isolation. They're insights forged in the crucible of life and death competition, tested against the most dangerous opponents, and proven across countless situations where failure meant not just personal defeat, but the destruction of everything I was sworn to protect. The sword I keep in my study once belonged to General Wei, a man whose name has been forgotten by history for good reason. He was everything most people think a warrior should be: brave, decisive in battle, respected by his soldiers. Yet he lost every campaign that mattered because he possessed the fatal flaw that destroys more careers and dreams than any external enemy ever could. He was purely reactive. General Wei would wait for his enemies to make the first move, then respond. With tremendous skill and courage, he believed this made him prudent and careful. What it actually made him was predictable and powerless. Every battle he fought was fought on terms chosen by his opponents, in locations selected by his enemies, at times that benefited everyone except him. I watched Wei lose a war he should have won easily. His forces were larger, better equipped, and more experienced than his opponent's army. His soldiers were loyal and disciplined. His supply lines were secure. On paper, victory was assured. In reality, he was doomed from the moment he decided to let his enemy dictate the terms of engagement. While Wei waited for clear signals about enemy intentions, his opponent was positioning forces in locations Wei hadn't even considered relevant. While Wei reacted to obvious threats, his enemy was creating situations where every possible response would weaken Wei's position. While Wei fought bravely against each challenge as it arose, his enemy was orchestrating a sequence of events that made Wei's eventual defeat inevitable. The most tragic part was watching Wei's growing frustration as he realized something was wrong but couldn't identify what. He won individual battles but kept losing strategic ground. His tactical victories felt hollow because they never translated into lasting advantage. He fought harder and harder while somehow becoming weaker and weaker. This is the curse of reactive thinking. Creates the illusion of engagement while guaranteeing powerlessness. Reactive people work tremendously hard, often harder than their more successful competitors, but their effort is spent responding to situations created by others, rather than creating situations that serve their own objectives. Reactive thinking feels safe because it seems to minimize risk. You wait to see what happens before committing to action. You gather more information before making decisions. You let situations develop naturally rather than forcing outcomes. This approach appeals to people who fear making mistakes, but it guarantees the biggest mistake of all: surrendering control over your own destiny. The fundamental problem with reactive thinking is that it puts you in a position where someone else's preparation determines your options. By the time you're reacting to their moves, they've already positioned themselves advantageously and limited your possible responses. You're not competing on equal terms. You're trying to solve problems they created under conditions they established. I learned to identify reactive thinkers quickly. They use phrases like "let's wait and see what develops, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." They pride themselves on flexibility and adaptability. They mistake hesitation for wisdom and preparation for overthinking. The antidote to reactive thinking is what I call strategic initiative, the commitment to shape circumstances rather than merely respond to them. Strategic initiative means making the first move, but not in the obvious way most people imagine. It means positioning yourself so advantageously that when others finally do react, their reactions only strengthen your position further. Every moment you spend in reactive mode is a moment your competitors spend gaining ground you'll never recover. Before every campaign, I would spend hours alone with a polished bronze mirror, conducting what I called my inner reconnaissance. This wasn't vanity, was the most crucial intelligence gathering I could perform. The mirror showed me not just my physical appearance, but forced me to confront the truth about my capabilities, my weaknesses, and my limitations. Most generals lost battles because they deceived themselves about their own strengths. Long before they encountered any external enemy, the bronze mirror of self-reflection became my most valuable strategic tool because it revealed the foundation upon which all strategy must be built. Absolute honesty about who you are and what you can actually accomplish. I learned that self-deception is the most dangerous enemy any leader can face, because it corrupts every decision that follows. My method for self-assessment was brutally systematic. I would examine my knowledge, what did I truly understand, versus what did I merely think I knew. I would evaluate my resources, not what I hoped to have or what I deserved to have, but what I actually possessed right now. I would analyze my skills. Where was I genuinely superior to my competitors, and where was I inferior or merely adequate? Most importantly, I would confront my emotional patterns under pressure. Did I become more decisive or more hesitant when stakes were highest? Did I think more clearly or less clearly when facing opposition? Did I inspire confidence in others during difficult moments? Or did my own uncertainty become contagious? These weren't philosophical questions, they were practical intelligence that would determine whether my strategies succeeded or failed. I remember preparing for what would become known as the Battle of Buyou. On paper, I was facing a vastly superior force with better equipment and more experienced officers. The conventional wisdom suggested I should retreat and wait for better circumstances. But my inner reconnaissance revealed something my advisors missed. While my enemy was stronger in obvious ways, one possessed advantages they couldn't see because I understood my own capabilities more clearly than they understood theirs. I knew my soldiers trusted my judgment completely, even in desperate situations. I knew I could maintain calm focus during chaos, while my opponent became agitated under pressure. I knew my understanding of terrain assessment was superior to his, and I knew I could make faster tactical adjustments because I had trained myself to think clearly while others were reacting emotionally. These insights came not from wishful thinking, but from years of honest self-evaluation. I had tested my capabilities in progressively more challenging situations, always seeking to understand my actual limits rather than my imagined limits. I knew exactly what I could deliver because I had done the work of knowing myself completely. The tragic mistake most people make is confusing self-confidence with self-knowledge. Self-confidence without self-knowledge is just arrogance waiting to be exposed. True self-knowledge includes unflinching awareness of your weaknesses and limitations, not to discourage yourself, but to work around them strategically. I developed what I called the Doctrine of authentic capability. Before committing to any strategy, I would ask myself, based on who I actually am right now, not who I hope to become or who I think I should be, can I execute this plan successfully? If the answer was anything less than a clear yes, I would either change the plan or change myself before proceeding. This inner reconnaissance also revealed my true motivations and desires. Was I pursuing this objective because it genuinely served my long-term interests, or because my ego wanted to prove something? Was I avoiding this challenge because it was genuinely unwise, or because I was afraid of failing. Understanding the difference between strategic wisdom and personal fear proved crucial in countless situations. The bronze mirror taught me that winning before the battle begins requires absolute clarity about the person who will be doing the fighting. Every strategy must be built on the foundation of who you actually are, not who you pretend to be. The silk scroll hidden in my private chambers contains intelligence that changed the course of 3 major campaigns, not because it revealed enemy troop movements or battle plans, but because it documented something far more valuable: the personal, psychology, and decision-making patterns of my opponents. While other generals focused on counting soldiers and cataloging weapons, I focused on understanding the minds that would be directing those resources. My approach to intelligence gathering went far beyond what most people consider reconnaissance. I wasn't just interested in what my enemies could do, needed to understand what they would do, when they would do it, and why they would make those choices. This required penetrating not just their defenses, but their thinking processes. Developed a network of observers who studied my opponent's behavior in situations that had nothing to do with warfare. How did they treat subordinates when they thought no one important was watching? How did they react to unexpected problems in their personal lives? What did they do when they felt secure versus when they felt threatened? Did they make decisions quickly or slowly? Did they stick to plans when circumstances changed, or did they adapt too readily? One of my most valuable intelligence coups came from learning that General Shao had a pattern of becoming overconfident after early successes. My observers noticed that in his personal dealings, Shao would relax his guard and become careless with details once he felt he had gained an advantage. This wasn't information you could gather by studying his military formations. You had to understand his character. When I finally faced Shao in battle, I deliberately allowed him several small victories early in the campaign. As predicted, his caution evaporated as soon as he felt he was winning. He began making increasingly bold moves without proper reconnaissance, eventually positioning his forces exactly where I needed them to be for my real strategy to unfold. His own psychology became my greatest weapon against him. The spy's coded message that changed everything contained a simple observation: my opponent's decision-making deteriorated significantly when he felt time pressure. Under normal circumstances, he was methodical and careful. When he felt rushed, he made predictable mistakes. So I created artificial time pressure by threatening something he cared about more than winning our immediate battle: his reputation with his own superiors. True intelligence gathering means understanding not just capabilities and intentions, but the psychological patterns that drive those intentions. Most people reveal their decision-making tendencies in low-stakes situations, long before they're tested in high-stakes environments. The way someone handles a minor inconvenience often predicts how they'll handle a major crisis. I learned to read people's true priorities by watching what they did, rather than listening to what they said. Someone might claim that honor matters most to them, but their actions revealed whether they would sacrifice tactical advantage for moral consistency. Someone might insist they were decisive leaders, but their behavior showed whether they truly committed to their decisions or kept second-guessing themselves. My intelligence network also focused on understanding my enemies' relationships and dependencies. Who did they rely on for crucial decisions? What happened to their performance when those people were unavailable? Where were the weak links in their support systems? Often, the fastest way to defeat a strong opponent was to understand their dependencies and disrupt those relationships. The most sophisticated intelligence concerned understanding my opponent's self-image and blind spots. What did they believe about their own capabilities that wasn't actually true? Where did their confidence exceed their competence? Every person has areas where they overestimate their abilities. Finding those areas gave me enormous leverage in determining how conflicts would unfold. Knowledge eliminates surprises. and surprises are what destroy even the best strategies. When you understand your opposition completely, you can predict their responses and plan accordingly. The high ground standard that flew above my command tent wasn't just a banner, it was a symbol of the most fundamental principle in all strategic thinking. Position determines outcome before any action is taken. The army that controls the high ground wins the battle before the first arrow is shot. Not because elevated terrain provides a small advantage, but because it creates a cascade of advantages that make victory inevitable. Most people misunderstand what I mean by positioning. They think it's about physical location, getting the corner office, sitting at the right table, being in the right place at the right time. These things matter, but they're symptoms of superior positioning, not the essence of it. True strategic positioning is about creating structural advantages that make your success automatic, while making your competitors' success nearly impossible. I learned this lesson during my first independent command, when I was tasked with defending a strategically important pass against a force twice the size of mine. The conventional approach would have been to fortify the narrowest point of the pass, and hope our defensive position could offset their numerical advantage. Instead, I spent 3 days studying the entire region, looking for a position that would give us leverage over the entire situation. What I discovered changed my understanding of strategy forever. There was an overlooked hill that controlled the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. It wasn't the obvious high ground, it wasn't even particularly defensible by traditional military standards. But any army that controlled that hill controlled whether the enemy could sustain a prolonged campaign in the region. By positioning my forces on that hill, I transformed the entire conflict. The enemy could take the pass, but they couldn't hold it without access to water. They could try to assault our position, but attacking uphill toward a well-supplied enemy while your own troops grew increasingly thirsty was suicide. They could try to find alternative water sources, but doing so would scatter their forces and expose them to defeat in detail. The enemy general was forced to choose between 3 bad options: retreat from the region entirely, divide his forces to secure alternative supply lines, or assault a position where every geographic factor favored the defender. Within a week, he withdrew without achieving any of his objectives. We won a decisive victory without fighting a single major engagement. This experience taught me that superior positioning creates what I call tactical inevitability. When you position yourself correctly, your opponent's options become so constrained that they can only make choices that benefit you. You're not just competing with them, you're controlling the terms under which the competition takes place. The key to understanding positioning is recognizing that every situation has multiple layers of terrain. There's the obvious terrain that everyone can see: the physical environment, the formal structure, the apparent rules of engagement. But there's also psychological terrain, economic terrain, political terrain, and temporal terrain. The master strategist learns to see all these layers simultaneously and position themselves advantageously across multiple dimensions. In my later campaigns, I became famous for choosing battlefields that seemed disadvantageous to casual observers, but gave me hidden leverage. I would position my forces where the enemy expected to trap us, only to reveal that the apparent trap was actually a carefully prepared killing ground that worked in our favor. I would occupy positions that looked weak but controlled crucial resources or communication lines. True positioning isn't about grabbing the best available spots, it's about understanding which position will give you control over the flow of events. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one that appears modest or even vulnerable, because it allows you to shape your opponent's responses while maintaining maximum flexibility for yourself. The standard bearer who carried my high ground banner once asked me why we sometimes avoided the obvious high ground in favor of positions that looked less advantageous. I told him that the highest ground isn't always the most elevated terrain, the position that gives you the most leverage over everything that matters to the outcome. When you understand positioning correctly, you stop fighting for territory and start fighting for leverage. The sundial in my war room marked more than the passage of hours. It reminded me that timing is the invisible force that transforms good strategies into brilliant victories and brilliant strategies into catastrophic failures. I have seen perfect plans fail because they were executed a day too early, and I have seen mediocre plans succeed beyond all expectations because they were implemented at precisely the right moment. Learning to recognize the perfect moment to act required me to understand the difference between patience and procrastination, between waiting for opportunity and creating opportunity. Most people mistake hesitation for wisdom, convincing themselves they're being strategic when they're actually being fearful. Others confuse urgency with importance, rushing into action because movement feels like progress. True timing means understanding the rhythm of events and positioning yourself to act when conditions are most favorable. It's not about waiting for perfect circumstances. Perfect circumstances never exist. It's about recognizing when the alignment of factors gives you maximum leverage for minimum risk. I discovered this during the siege of Ying, where conventional wisdom demanded either immediate assault or prolonged blockade. Instead, I studied the patterns within the city. I learned when the defenders changed guard rotations, when supplies were distributed, when morale was highest and lowest. More importantly, I understood the political pressures my enemy was facing from his own superiors. The perfect moment revealed itself not through military intelligence, but through understanding human psychology. My opponent was under increasing pressure to demonstrate decisive action. His own allies were growing impatient with defensive tactics. His soldiers were becoming restless from inactivity. Meanwhile, my forces were growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. I recognized that in 3 more days, my enemy would be forced by circumstances to attempt something aggressive, regardless of whether conditions favored such action. So I positioned my forces to appear vulnerable to exactly the kind of assault his political situation would compel him to attempt. When he finally acted, it was with desperation rather than strategy, at a time that benefited me far more than him. The sundial taught me that every situation has its own temporal rhythm. There are moments when your opponents are strong and confident, and moments when they're weak and uncertain. There are times when your own capabilities are at their peak, and times when you need to conserve resources. The master strategist learns to read these rhythms and synchronize their actions. Accordingly, timing also means understanding the difference between preparation time and action time. During preparation time, speed is your enemy. Rushing your preparations leads to overlooked details and weak foundations. During action time, hesitation is your enemy once the moment arrives. Decisive movement becomes crucial. I learned to create artificial deadlines that forced my opponents to act before they were ready, while ensuring my own preparations were complete well before I needed them. This meant I could act swiftly when opportunities presented themselves, while my enemies were still scrambling to respond to changing circumstances. The most sophisticated aspect of timing involves creating cascading sequences where one perfectly timed action triggers a series of responses that serve your larger strategy. Like placing dominoes, you position events so that when you finally push the first piece, the entire sequence unfolds according to your design. Timing isn't about waiting for the right moment, it's about preparing so thoroughly that you can recognize and seize the right moment when it arrives. The sundial reminded me daily that opportunity is always moving, and the strategist who understands its rhythm holds an almost supernatural advantage over those who simply react to circumstances as they unfold. The empty fortress gate that stands in my memory represents one of the most counterintuitive yet powerful strategies I ever employed, deliberately appearing weaker than I actually was to lure my enemies into fatal overconfidence. Most generals spend enormous energy projecting strength and intimidating opponents. I learned that sometimes the greatest strength lies in convincing your enemies to underestimate your true capabilities. This principle revealed itself during my campaign against General Pang, whose forces significantly outnumbered mine, but whose judgment became dangerously clouded by early success. Instead of attempting to project strength I didn't possess, I decided to amplify his perception of my weakness while secretly strengthening my actual position. I ordered my troops to appear disorganized during our initial skirmishes. I allowed him to capture supplies that suggested we were running low on provisions. I even staged arguments between my officers where his spies could observe them, creating the impression that my command structure was fracturing under pressure. Every piece of intelligence he gathered painted a picture of an army on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, I was using his overconfidence to position my forces exactly where I needed them. While Pang focused on pressing what he perceived as his overwhelming advantage, I was quietly securing strategic positions he considered irrelevant because he assumed I was too weak to use them effectively. The psychology of overconfidence is remarkably predictable. When people believe they're fighting a weaker opponent, they make three consistent mistakes. They become careless with their own preparations. They underestimate the resources needed for victory, and they rush toward engagement instead of maintaining strategic patience. Pang made all three errors. Convinced of easy victory, he stopped gathering intelligence about my actual capabilities. He divided his forces to pursue multiple objectives simultaneously because he believed I lacked the strength to exploit such division. Most crucially, he attacked my apparent weakest position at the moment when it was actually my strongest. The empty fortress gate became my signature tactic, appearing to leave obvious vulnerabilities that were actually carefully prepared traps. I would position forces in ways that looked like strategic errors to conventional military thinking, knowing that overconfident enemies would rush to exploit what they perceived as my mistakes. This strategy requires tremendous psychological discipline. You must resist the natural impulse to demonstrate your capabilities when you're actually strong. You must endure the discomfort of being underestimated and possibly ridiculed. You must maintain your deception even when part of you wants to reveal your true strength to gain respect. The key to successful strategic humility is ensuring that your apparent weakness serves a specific purpose rather than simply hiding your capabilities. Appearing weak without strategic purpose is just actual weakness. Appearing weak to manipulate your opponent's behavior while secretly strengthening your position, that's strategic genius. I learned to identify which aspects of strength to conceal and which to reveal. Sometimes you want enemies to underestimate your resources, sometimes your resolve, sometimes your intelligence or preparation. The specific deception depends on your opponent's psychology and the kind of overconfidence you want to induce. The empty fortress gate taught me that in a world where everyone expects you to project strength constantly, the person who strategically appears weak often holds the greatest advantage. Your enemies prepare for the strength they can see, not the strength you choose to keep hidden until the decisive moment when everyone expects intimidation. Strategic humility becomes the ultimate surprise. The massive war drum that thundered across battlefields served a purpose far more sophisticated than rallying my own troops. It was an instrument of psychological warfare, designed to convince enemies that fighting me would be so costly that victory, even if possible, wouldn't be worth the price. Sometimes the greatest victory is the battle you never have to fight because your reputation alone accomplishes your objectives. I discovered the power of strategic intimidation during my early campaigns, when I realized that my growing reputation was becoming as valuable as my actual military capabilities. Enemies who had never faced me directly were already making decisions based on stories they had heard about my methods. I learned to cultivate and project this reputation deliberately, using it as a weapon that required no soldiers to wield effectively. The war drum became my signature because it represented overwhelming force even when my actual numbers were modest. The sound carried for miles, creating the impression of massive armies preparing for battle. Enemy scouts would hear the drumming and report back that I commanded forces larger than I actually possessed. More importantly, the psychological impact of that deep, resonating sound affected enemy morale before any fighting began. Strategic intimidation works because most people prefer to avoid conflicts. They believe they cannot win decisively. When you project sufficient strength, rational opponents will often choose negotiation over confrontation, concession over resistance, retreat over engagement. The key is making your strength appear so overwhelming that the cost of opposing you seems prohibitive. I learned to time displays of strength for maximum psychological impact. After achieving a significant victory, I would ensure that news of my success spread quickly and dramatically. I would stage impressive military demonstrations where enemy spies could observe them. I would make strategic moves that revealed just enough of my capabilities to suggest vast reserves of power held in reserve. The most sophisticated aspect of projecting strength is understanding what kind of strength to emphasize for different opponents. Some enemies are intimidated by displays of military precision and discipline. Others are more affected by demonstrations of strategic unpredictability. Still others respond most strongly to evidence of superior resources or intelligence capabilities. During my campaign in the southern provinces, I faced a coalition of local leaders who were considering resistance to my advance. Rather than fighting them individually, which would have been costly and time-consuming, I arranged for them to witness a demonstration of my army's capabilities during what appeared to be routine training exercises. The demonstration was carefully choreographed to showcase not just our martial skills, but our logistical sophistication, our communication efficiency, and our ability to coordinate complex operations flawlessly. The local leaders realized that opposing us would require resources and coordination they simply didn't possess. Most submitted voluntarily rather than face certain defeat. The balance between projecting strength and maintaining authenticity is crucial. Your reputation must be built on genuine capabilities, or it will crumble when tested. The war drum could intimidate because it represented real force, not imaginary power. Bluffing works only until someone calls your bluff. I learned that the most effective strength projection combines visible demonstrations with mysterious reserves. Show enough capability to establish credibility, but suggest that what enemies can see represents only a fraction of your total power. This creates uncertainty about the true extent of your resources, making opposition seem like an unacceptable gamble. When everyone knows you can win, often you don't have to fight to prove it. The river's coarse stone sits beside my writing desk as a constant reminder of nature's most profound strategic lesson. Water never fights the rock directly, yet given time, it carves through the hardest granite by finding the path of least resistance and applying persistent, gentle pressure. This principle transformed my understanding of power and taught me that the most elegant victories come not from overwhelming force, but from redirecting existing forces to serve your purposes. Direct confrontation appeals to our instincts because it feels decisive and heroic. We imagine ourselves charging straight toward our objectives, overcoming obstacles through superior strength or determination. But I learned that direct action often squanders resources while producing minimal results, whereas indirect action can achieve enormous outcomes with surprisingly little effort. My most instructive experience with indirect action came during the siege of a fortress that had withstood direct assaults for over a year. Previous commanders had thrown wave after wave of soldiers against its walls, achieving nothing but massive casualties. The fortress seemed impregnable if I stopped thinking about how to break through its defenses and started thinking about how to make the defenders want to leave. Instead of attacking the fortress, I redirected the river that supplied its water. This required several weeks of engineering work with my troops, but no combat casualties. Instead of storming the gates, I cut off the trade routes that supplied the city's food. This involved negotiating with merchants and local leaders rather than fighting. Instead of battling the garrison directly, I spread carefully crafted information that made the defenders question whether their own leaders were committed to holding the position. Within 2 months, the fortress surrendered without a single major battle. The defenders walked out voluntarily, many of them joining my forces rather than continuing to serve leaders they had lost faith in. What a year of direct assault couldn't accomplish, indirect pressure achieved with minimal cost and maximum psychological impact. The stone taught me that indirect action works by changing the conditions that make your opponent's current position sustainable. Rather than fighting their strength, you will undermine the foundations that support their strength. Rather than confronting their will directly, you alter the circumstances that shape their will. This principle applies far beyond military situations. In negotiations, indirect action means influencing the factors that drive the other party's decision-making, rather than arguing with their stated positions. In competition, it means changing the rules of the game, rather than trying to beat opponents. At a game designed to favor them, I learned to identify the hidden dependencies that made my opponent's positions possible. What resources did they require to maintain their current strategy? What relationships did they depend on for support? What assumptions were their plans built upon? By addressing these underlying factors, I could often achieve my objectives while my opponents were still preparing to defend against direct attacks they expected, but that never came. The most sophisticated indirect action involves creating situations where your opponents accomplish your objectives for you while believing they're pursuing their own interests. This requires understanding their motivations deeply enough to design scenarios where serving your goals also serves theirs, at least temporarily. The river's persistence reminds me that indirect action often requires patience that direct action doesn't demand. Water doesn't reshape landscapes overnight. It works steadily, consistently, relentlessly, but the results, when they finally manifest, are often more complete and permanent than anything force could have achieved. When you learn to flow around obstacles rather than through them, you discover that most barriers are far more fragile than they appear. The maze of no exit that I constructed during the campaign against the Three Kingdoms Alliance wasn't built from walls or barriers, it was woven from choices. Each path my enemies could take, leading them deeper into disadvantage while appearing to offer hope of escape. The most devastating victories come not from defeating your opponents directly, but from creating situations where every decision they make strengthens your position while weakening theirs. This principle emerged from studying trapped animals and observing how the most effective hunters don't chase their prey, they create circumstances where the prey traps itself. A skilled hunter positions barriers and incentives so that the animal's natural responses to perceived threats drive it toward the exact location where capture becomes inevitable. My opportunity to test this concept came when facing the Triple Alliance, three kingdoms that had united specifically to counter my expanding influence. Individually, each was manageable. Together, they possessed resources and coordination that made direct confrontation extremely costly. I needed to fragment their alliance while simultaneously dealing with each kingdom's capabilities. That the maze I constructed was psychological and strategic rather than physical. I began by creating situations where cooperation between the allies became increasingly difficult while making individual action appear more attractive. I offered selective advantages to whichever kingdom moved first on certain opportunities. Knowing this would create suspicion and competition among partners who needed to trust each other completely. Each kingdom faced the same basic choice: cooperate fully with their allies and risk missing individual opportunities, or pursue their own interests and risk weakening the alliance. I designed scenarios where both choices served my strategic objectives. When they cooperated, their decision-making became slow and cumbersome, giving me time to strengthen my position. When they acted independently, they weakened their collective power and became vulnerable to defeat in detail. The most elegant aspect of this maze was that I never forced any kingdom to make decisions that seemed obviously against their interests. Every choice I presented appeared reasonable from their perspective. The trap lay not in any single decision, but in the cumulative effect of multiple choices that seemed individually rational but collectively created impossible situations. For example, I created border disputes that required each kingdom to choose between defending their territorial integrity or maintaining full military cooperation with their allies. Defending their borders was clearly reasonable and necessary, but doing so meant withdrawing forces from the collective effort against me. I presented trade opportunities that benefited individual kingdoms, but created economic dependencies that made future military cooperation more complex. Within 6 months, the Triple Alliance had dissolved into 3 separate conflicts that I could address sequentially rather than simultaneously. Each kingdom found itself fighting not just me, but also dealing with the consequences of choices their former allies had made. The maze had worked exactly as designed. My enemies had defeated themselves by pursuing their own rational self within constraints I had created. The key to building effective mazes is understanding that people will always choose what appears to be their best available option. Your task isn't to force them into obviously bad choices, but to ensure that their best available options serve your strategy better than theirs. This requires thinking several moves ahead and understanding how individual decisions create cumulative effects. The maze of no exit teaches us that the most powerful victories come from giving your opponents exactly what they think they want, while ensuring that getting it puts them in a position where they cannot ultimately win. True strategic mastery means making your opponent's rational decisions work against their own interests. The lightning strike banner that flew above my command during the Battle of Red Cliffs represented a paradox that took me years to understand. The fastest action comes from the slowest preparation, and the most decisive victories emerge from the most patient planning. Most people confuse speed with haste and mistake urgency for importance, creating a fundamental misunderstanding about when to move quickly and when to move deliberately. I learnt this principle through painful experience. During my early campaigns, when I confused rapid movement with strategic brilliance, I would rush into action the moment opportunities appeared, believing that speed alone would give me advantage over more methodical opponents. What I discovered instead was that hasty action based on insufficient preparation consistently produces inferior results compared to swift action based on thorough preparation. The distinction became clear during my preparation for what historians now call the Campaign of 7 Days. Intelligence indicated that my enemy was planning a major offensive that would begin within 2 weeks. My initial instinct was to strike immediately before his preparations were complete. Instead, I forced myself to spend 10 days in intensive preparation, leaving only 4 days to execute my counter-strategy. Those 10 days of preparation transformed every aspect of my approach. I used the time to understand my enemy's likely routes of advance, to position supplies where my forces would need them, to establish communication networks that would function during combat, and to rehearse complex maneuvers until they became automatic. Most importantly, I used the preparation time to identify and eliminate potential points of failure in my plan. When I finally moved, the action was devastatingly swift because every element had been anticipated and prepared for. My forces moved with precision that appeared supernatural to observers who hadn't witnessed the preparation phase. Supply lines functioned flawlessly because we had tested them. Communications remained clear because we had established redundant systems. Tactical adjustments happened smoothly because we had rehearsed multiple contingencies. The lightning strike banner became my symbol because it captured this essential truth. Lightning appears instantaneous, but it results from the build-up of electrical potential over time. The visible flash represents the release of energy that has been accumulating invisibly. Similarly, decisive action appears sudden to observers, but it's actually the culmination of extensive preparation that most people never see. I developed what I called the doctrine of prepared spontaneity. During preparation phases, I would move deliberately, checking every detail and considering every possibility. I refused to be rushed during this crucial period, even when advisors urged faster action. But once preparation was complete, I would strike with overwhelming speed and commitment, faster than opponents who had spent their time reacting to immediate pressures rather than preparing for decisive action. The most counterintuitive aspect of this principle is that thorough preparation actually creates more opportunities for swift action, not fewer. When you understand your capabilities completely, when you've anticipated likely obstacles, when you've positioned resources strategically, you can respond to changing circumstances much faster than someone who must figure out these elements while also trying to act. My enemies often accused me of supernatural timing, claiming I had uncanny ability to appear at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right force. What they interpreted as mystical intuition was actually the result of systematic preparation that allowed me to recognize and exploit opportunities as they developed. The lightning strike taught me that in a world where everyone rushes toward immediate action, the person who prepares thoroughly and then moves decisively holds an almost insurmountable advantage. While others are still figuring out what to do, you're already doing it flawlessly. True speed comes from never having to hesitate about what to do next. The Scout's telescope that I carried on every campaign served a purpose far beyond simply magnifying distant objects. It represented my commitment to seeing the complete picture of any competitive environment before committing forces to action. Most commanders focus exclusively on their enemies and their own capabilities, missing the countless environmental factors that often determine outcomes more powerfully than military strength or strategic brilliance. I learned to read battlefields like scholars read ancient texts, searching for subtle details that revealed hidden advantages and concealed dangers. Every terrain feature, every weather pattern, every seasonal consideration became part of my strategic calculations. The general who understands the environment completely can make the environment itself fight on his behalf. My most instructive experience with environmental awareness came during the siege of Shaoyang, where conventional military analysis suggested a straightforward assault would succeed within days. The enemy garrison was small, their fortifications were modest, and my forces significantly outnumbered theirs. Every tactical manual would have recommended immediate attack, but my telescope revealed factors that changed everything. The approach to the fortress required crossing marshy ground that would become impassable during the rainy season, which local knowledge indicated would begin within a week. The fortress's water supply came from an underground spring that could be redirected if I understood the local geology correctly. Most importantly, the political situation in the region meant that a prolonged siege would actually benefit me more than a quick victory. Instead of attacking immediately, I used the environmental factors to transform the entire conflict. I positioned my forces to control the high ground around the fortress just before the rains began, making retreat impossible for the defenders while ensuring my own supply lines remained secure. I spent time understanding the underground water flow and redirected it away from the fortress. Most crucially, I used the delay to negotiate with local leaders, who became increasingly willing to support me as it became clear I wasn't just another raiding army passing through. The telescope taught me that every environment contains multiple layers of relevant information. There's the obvious tactical terrain that everyone can see: hills, rivers, forests, buildings. But there's also logistical terrain that determines where supplies can be moved efficiently. There's political terrain that shapes which allies are available and which enemies are likely. There's economic terrain that affects motivation and sustainability. There's even psychological terrain that influences morale and decision-making. I developed systematic methods for environmental assessment that my staff came to call the complete scan. Before any major operation, we would analyze weather patterns, supply route options, local political dynamics, seasonal considerations, and cultural factors that might affect the conflict. This comprehensive analysis often revealed opportunities that pure military thinking would miss entirely. The most sophisticated aspect of reading environments is understanding how different factors interact with each other. A river that seems like an obstacle during dry season becomes a defensive advantage during flood season. A mountain pass that's easily defended in summer becomes a trap during winter storms. Local populations that appear neutral during peacetime often choose sides once they understand which way the conflict is likely to resolve. Environmental awareness also means recognizing how your own actions change the environment for future operations. Every choice you make alters the landscape of possibilities for subsequent decisions. The wise strategist considers not just immediate environmental factors, but how those factors will evolve based on current actions. When you learn to make the environment your ally, you multiply your effective strength while constraining your opponent's options. The victor's mindset scroll that I studied before every major engagement contained not battle plans or tactical diagrams, but mental preparation techniques that I considered more valuable than any weapon in my arsenal. I discovered early in my career that physical victory is merely the external manifestation of psychological victory, and that the general who wins the mental battle first makes the physical battle almost inevitable. The scroll reminded me that every conflict is fought twice, once in the mind and once in reality. The outcome of the mental battle usually determines the outcome of the physical battle, because psychological advantage shapes every decision, every response, and every moment of execution that follows. My understanding of victory psychology began during my first independent command, when I faced an opponent whose forces were equivalent to mine in every measurable way. Our armies were similar in size, training, and equipment. Our strategic positions were roughly equal. Military textbooks would have predicted a prolonged, costly conflict with uncertain outcome, but I recognized that the real battle would be won or lost in the realm of confidence, certainty, and mental composure. I spent weeks before the engagement developing what I called absolute inner conviction, the unshakable belief that my victory was not just possible, but inevitable. This wasn't blind optimism or wishful thinking. It was the result of exhaustive preparation that eliminated every doubt about my readiness and capability. The scroll contained techniques I had developed for achieving this psychological state. I would visualize every aspect of the coming battle, not just successful outcomes, but every possible challenge and my response to each one. I would rehearse in my mind the feeling of remaining calm and decisive under extreme pressure. I would cultivate the inner certainty that comes from knowing you have prepared more thoroughly than your opponent. Most importantly, I learned to distinguish between confidence and certainty. Confidence can be shaken by unexpected developments or initial setbacks. Certainty runs deeper. It's the psychological foundation that remains steady regardless of temporary circumstances. Certainty comes from knowing that your preparation has been so complete that you can handle whatever develops. This inner certainty became visible to everyone around me, and its effects were extraordinary. My officers approached decisions with greater boldness because they could sense my unwavering resolve. My soldiers fought with unusual determination because they believed absolutely in our eventual success. Even my enemies began making more cautious, defensive choices because something in my bearing suggested that opposing me was futile. The psychological preparation also included techniques for maintaining composure during the inevitable moments of confusion and pressure that occur in any serious conflict. I practiced mental exercises that allowed me to remain clear-thinking when others became reactive. I developed internal anchors, core principles, and perspectives that kept me centered when circumstances became chaotic. The most sophisticated aspect of victory psychology is understanding how your mental state affects not just your own performance, but the performance of everyone around you. Confidence is contagious, but so is doubt. Certainty inspires others to rise to their highest capabilities, while uncertainty causes them to hesitate and perform below their potential. I learned to project psychological victory through subtle behavioral cues that opponents and allies alike could sense but not necessarily articulate. The way I moved, spoke, and made decisions communicated absolute conviction that outcomes would unfold according to my design. This projection became self-fulfilling as people adjusted their own behavior to align with what seemed inevitable. The Victor's Mindset Scroll taught me that the most important victory is the one you achieve over your own doubts and limitations. When you know with complete certainty that you will find a way to succeed regardless of circumstances, that certainty transforms every aspect of your external performance. True victory begins in the mind and works its way outward into reality. The modern strategy board that sits in boardrooms today operates on the same fundamental principles that governed ancient battlefields: position, timing, intelligence, and psychological advantage determine outcomes before any direct competition occurs. The tools have evolved from bronze weapons to digital platforms, but the underlying dynamics of winning before the battle begins remain unchanged. I observe today's corporate warriors making the same mistakes that doomed generals throughout history. They focus on obvious competitive moves, price wars, feature races, marketing battles, while ignoring the strategic positioning that makes such direct confrontations unnecessary. They react to competitor initiatives instead of creating situations that force competitors to react to them. They mistake activity for strategy and movement for progress. Let me show you how my principles apply to your modern challenges. When you're competing for a promotion, most people think the battle is won through superior performance in their current role. This is like a general believing battles are won through superior fighting ability alone. The real battle for promotion is won through strategic positioning that makes your advancement feel inevitable too. Decision-makers. Intelligence gathering in corporate environments follows the same patterns I used against ancient enemies. You must understand not just your competitors' capabilities, but their decision-making patterns, their priorities, their constraints, and their blind spots. Who influences their thinking? What pressures are they under? What would make them change their current strategy? How do they typically respond to different types of challenges? The executive who interviewed 5 people for your dream position had already made psychological decisions about each candidate before the formal interviews began. Your task isn't to win the interview, it's to win the positioning battle that occurs before the interview. This means understanding what problems keep this executive awake at night, what success looks like from their perspective, and how to position yourself as the inevitable solution to their challenges. Strategic positioning in professional environments means identifying the high ground that your competitors don't recognize as valuable. Perhaps it's becoming the person everyone consults on certain types of decisions. Perhaps it's developing relationships with key stakeholders that others overlook. Perhaps it's gaining expertise in areas that will become crucial before others realize their importance. I watch modern professionals make the same timing errors that destroyed ancient armies. They move too quickly on opportunities that require patience, and too slowly on opportunities that require immediate action. They confuse being busy with being productive, and urgency with importance. The professional who masters timing, who moves swiftly when the moment is right, but waits strategically when conditions aren't, favorable, gains enormous advantage over those who simply react to immediate pressures. The art of indirect action translates perfectly to corporate environments. Instead of competing directly for limited resources, you create new categories where you hold natural advantages. Instead of arguing for your position in meetings, you influence the factors that shape how decisions are framed. Instead of fighting competitors on their chosen ground, you change the rules of engagement to favor your strengths. Modern intelligence networks aren't built with spies, but with strategic relationships that give you insight into industry trends, organizational changes, and emerging opportunities before your competitors recognize them. The professional who knows about changes in company direction, shifts in customer preferences, or new regulatory requirements before others can position themselves advantageously, while competitors are still reacting to yesterday's information. The psychology of victory remains identical across centuries. The executive who projects quiet confidence based on thorough preparation commands more respect than the one who tries to intimidate through aggressive posturing. The professional who demonstrates strategic thinking inspires more trust than the one who simply works harder than everyone else. Your modern battlefield includes email communications, meeting dynamics, project ownership, and relationship building. Each of these arenas operates according to strategic principles that haven't changed since ancient times. The person who understands positioning will choose the right projects. The person who understands timing will know when to advance ideas and when to wait. The person who gathers intelligence will anticipate changes before others see them coming. Victory in corporate competition, like victory in ancient warfare, belongs to those who win before the battle begins. The avalanche stone that I keep as a reminder of power's true nature appears insignificant to casual observers, a small rock, no larger than a man's fist. Yet this stone once triggered a landslide that blocked an entire mountain pass, transforming the outcome of a campaign without requiring a single soldier to draw his sword. This humble stone taught me that strategic thinking creates exponential returns through the compound effect of small, well-positioned actions. Most people seek immediate, dramatic results from their efforts. They want their next decision to transform their situation completely. This mindset causes them to overlook the small strategic moves that, when accumulated over time, create overwhelming advantages that appear sudden to observers but are actually the inevitable result of patient compound positioning. I learned this principle during my longest campaign, a 3-year effort to bring the eastern provinces under unified control. Each individual action I took seemed modest, establishing a relationship with a local merchant here, positioning a small garrison there, creating a favorable trade agreement in another location. My opponents dismissed these moves as insignificant, because none produced immediate dramatic results. But I was playing a longer game. Each small strategic move created conditions that made the next move more powerful. The merchant relationship gave me intelligence about regional politics. The garrison provided security that encouraged more merchants to operate in the area. The trade agreement created economic incentives for local leaders to support stability. None of these actions alone would have determined the campaign's outcome, But together they created a network of advantages that became overwhelming. The avalanche effect began to manifest in the second year. Local leaders who had remained neutral started supporting my efforts because my presence had made their regions more prosperous. Potential opponents found that their traditional allies were no longer available because those allies now benefited from arrangements I had established. Intelligence flowed to me more readily because I had invested in relationships with people throughout the region by the third year. What had begun as individual strategic moves had become a self-reinforcing system. My economic arrangements created political support, which enabled military positioning, which secured trade routes, which generated resources that funded further expansion. Each element strengthened every other element, creating compound growth that accelerated without requiring proportional increases in effort. The most powerful aspect of strategic compounding is that it appears deceptively slow at first, then becomes explosively fast. For months or even years, your strategic investments may seem to produce minimal returns. Competitors who focus on immediate results will appear to be advancing faster, but strategic thinking creates a foundation that eventually generates returns, far exceeding what direct approaches can achieve. I learned to identify which actions would compound over time versus which would produce only immediate effects. Relationships compound each person. You serve well becomes a source of opportunities and intelligence that serves you indefinitely. Reputation compounds each demonstration of competence and reliability makes future cooperation easier and more valuable. Knowledge compounds each skill you master makes learning related skills faster and more effective. The patience required for strategic compounding is perhaps the most difficult aspect of this approach. You must continue making strategic investments, even when others question their value. You must resist the temptation to abandon long-term positioning for short-term gains. You must maintain confidence in your approach even when immediate results are modest. The avalanche stone reminds me that small actions, positioned strategically and allowed to compound over time, create forces that no amount of direct effort can match. The professional who builds relationships consistently, the leader who invests in capabilities systematically, the strategist who positions resources patiently. These people eventually achieve results that appear miraculous to those who only see the final avalanche, not the years of careful stone placement that made it inevitable. True strategic power accumulates silently until it becomes irresistible. The personal battle plan that I'm about to help you create represents the culmination of everything. I've shared a customized strategy document that adapts my principles to your unique situation and transforms ancient wisdom into practical action for your specific challenges. This isn't about following a predetermined formula, but about developing your own strategic thinking capabilities that will serve you throughout your life. Creating your personal art of war begins with honest assessment, using the bronze mirror principle I taught you earlier. What are your actual strengths and capabilities right now, not what you hope they'll become? What resources do you genuinely control? What relationships and knowledge do you possess? Where are your real limitations and blind spots? This foundation of self-knowledge must be ruthlessly accurate because every strategic decision will build upon it. Next, conduct intelligence gathering on your specific competitive environment. Who are the people whose decisions affect your opportunities? What pressures and motivations drive their choices? What information do they value? What patterns characterize their decision-making under different circumstances? Remember, you're not just gathering facts, you're developing deep understanding of the human dynamics that shape your world. Now identify your strategic positioning opportunities. Where can you establish advantages that others don't recognize as valuable? What high ground exists in your profession or situation that competitors are ignoring? How can you position yourself so that when opportunities arise, you're the obvious choice? Strategic positioning often means investing time and energy in areas that don't provide immediate returns, but create compound advantages over time. Your timing strategy requires understanding the rhythms and cycles that affect your environment. When do key decisions typically get made in your organization or industry? What seasonal patterns affect opportunities? How can you prepare thoroughly for predictable events while remaining ready to act swiftly when unexpected opportunities arise? Timing mastery comes from anticipating patterns while maintaining flexibility for exceptions. Build your personal intelligence network systematically. Identify people who can provide insights about trends, changes, and opportunities before they become obvious to everyone. Invest in relationships that give you early warning about shifts in your environment. Create systems for gathering and processing information that affects your strategic positioning. Remember, intelligence networks are built through genuine service to others, not through extraction of information. Develop your capabilities for both direct and indirect action. Direct action serves you when you have clear advantages and the situation favors straightforward approaches. Indirect action becomes crucial when you're facing stronger opponents or when direct confrontation would be costly. Master the art of achieving your objectives by changing the conditions of competition rather than simply competing harder within existing conditions. Practice psychological preparation using the techniques from my Victor's Mindset Scroll. Develop unshakable inner certainty based on thorough preparation rather than wishful thinking. Learn to maintain composure and clear thinking under pressure. Cultivate the kind of quiet confidence that inspires others and influences outcomes through your presence and bearing. Most importantly, commit to strategic thinking as a lifelong practice rather than a temporary technique. Strategic mastery isn't achieved through single brilliant moves, but through consistent application of strategic principles over time. Every situation you encounter becomes an opportunity to strengthen your strategic capabilities and deepen your understanding of human dynamics. Your personal battle plan should be a living document that evolves as you gain experience and as your environment changes. Regular review and adjustment ensure that your strategy remains relevant and effective. The ancient principles never change, but their application must adapt to new circumstances and emerging opportunities. The commitment required for strategic mastery extends beyond learning techniques, requires developing a different way of seeing and thinking about challenges. You must learn to see beyond immediate circumstances to underlying patterns and possibilities. You must develop patience for strategic positioning while maintaining readiness for swift action. When you truly master your personal art of war, you join the ranks of those who win before battles begin. The eternal flame of victory that burns in my memory represents something far more profound than military conquest or personal achievement. It symbolizes the transformative power of strategic thinking to fundamentally change not just what you accomplish, but who you become in the process. When you truly master the art of winning before battles begin, you don't just achieve different outcomes, you become a different person entirely. Looking back across the campaigns and conflicts that shaped my understanding, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't any single battle won or territory conquered. The greatest victory was the transformation from someone who reacted to circumstances into someone who shaped circumstances. This transformation affects every aspect of your existence, from the smallest daily decisions to the most significant life choices. Strategic thinking changes how you perceive challenges. Where others see obstacles, you see positioning opportunities. Where others see competition, you see intelligence gathering possibilities. Where others see setbacks, you see information about what adjustments your strategy requires. This shift in perception alone creates enormous advantages because you're operating with fundamentally different assumptions about what's possible. The ripple effects of strategic mastery extend far beyond your immediate objectives. The relationships you build through strategic thinking become sources of opportunity and support throughout your life. The reputation you establish through consistent strategic behavior opens doors that remain closed to others. The capabilities you develop while learning to think strategically serve you in contexts you never anticipated when you first began this journey. I've watched students of strategic thinking discover that mastering these principles transforms their family relationships, their financial decisions, their health choices, and their personal development. Strategic thinking isn't just a professional skill, it's a life philosophy that creates compound improvements across every domain of human experience. The legacy you create through strategic excellence isn't measured only in personal achievements. When you consistently demonstrate strategic thinking, you inspire others to develop these capabilities themselves. You become a source of wisdom and guidance for people facing their own challenges. You contribute to a culture where thoughtful preparation and intelligent positioning are valued over reactive scrambling and brute force approaches. Your strategic future depends on understanding that these principles represent the beginning of a journey, not the destination. Every situation you encounter will test and strengthen your strategic capabilities. Every challenge will reveal new applications for these timeless concepts. Every success will teach you something about the subtle art of winning before battles begin. The eternal flame burns because these principles transcend any individual conflict or competitive situation. Long after specific battles are forgotten, the strategic thinking capabilities you develop will continue serving you in ways you cannot currently imagine. Future challenges that don't yet exist will yield to the same fundamental approaches that have guided successful leaders throughout history. As you move forward from here, remember that strategic mastery requires both humility and confidence. Humility to continue learning from every experience, and confidence to trust in principles that have proven effective across centuries of human conflict and competition. The balance between these qualities creates the kind of leader others instinctively want to follow and support. The flame that represents your strategic future burns brightest when you understand that winning before battles begin isn't about defeating others, it's about creating value and opportunities that benefit everyone involved. The highest expression of strategic thinking creates victories where everyone gains something valuable, even those who might initially appear to be your competitors. Your journey into strategic mastery begins now. With your next decision and your next action, the eternal principles await your application. The strategic future you create will become the legacy you leave for others to follow. The art of winning before battles begin is now yours to practice and perfect.